Welcome back to another episode of Swamp Stories. For this episode, we cover one of California's untold tales, a hidden story that deserves its recognition. So get ready because this one is wild. But before we get into it, let me run the intro. We start out in 1967. At this time, the streets of California were a complete toss-up. At most, neighborhoods had their own small affiliations. For example, in East LA, you had Maravilla and White Fence, but there were no larger establishments that tied multiple cities together. So if you were from East LA and went up to Santa Cruz for a weekend, there were absolutely no problems. People from up north wouldn't bother you for being from LA or because of any affiliations. And of course, the same was true in reverse. However, in 1968, that concept would start to change. Now, if you entered the prison system, you were faced with a difficult choice. You either fend for yourself or you join one of two organizations. It's either La M or NF. And for those who don't know, these are two bitter rivals in the system. Well, here's how it played out. NF consisted of over 90% Northern Californians. And on the other hand, La M consisted of the reverse. So naturally, it became a battle of Northern and Southern California. At first, it was just in the system, but then it spilled over into the streets. When members were released back into society, they kept their affiliations. The only difference is they called themselves by different names. To simplify, the NF members called themselves Norteños, Nortes, or Northsiders. On the other hand, La M called themselves Sureños, SAs, or Southsiders. For whatever reason, the North adopted the color red and the South adopted the color blue. Well, from the 1970s on, the North remained mostly red and the South remained completely blue. The only areas who had both were cities like Fresno, Visalia, or Bakersfield, also known as the cities that nobody cares about. However, in the early 2000s, a new trend started making way. Southsiders began moving up north to the Bay Area. Even visiting the North while representing the South Side was risky, so choosing to move there? Ooh-wee. But here's how it actually went. Slowly but surely, the Southsiders established their own hoods in the Bay Area. The first major takeover was the North Mission District of San Francisco. I actually covered this in a previous video. Next, we have the Lomita Park area of San Bruno, right across from the airport. After this, they claimed an area of East Palo Alto. As we move south, we get to the city of San Jose. And here they claim nearly half the city, over a dozen barrios just in San Jose. Then we have Oakland, and this was a difficult place for them to establish. However, they do have one small area off 55th and International. The Oakland story is wild, and I can cover that in a separate episode. Anyways, next we have a small area in San Rafael called the Canal District. There, Southsiders and MS have taken over all of the Section 8 housing. Well, that covers most of the Southsider hoods in the Bay Area. And in each of these sections, rivalries have been going on since the very start. But in this episode, we cover the Southsiders' biggest stronghold in the whole Bay. This is the story of how they took over the city of Richmond. Welcome to Richmond, California, a city plagued by poverty, violence, and polluted air. Since the very start, Richmond has been a tough blue-collar city, but things got unbearably bad in the 1990s. In 1992, Richmond was rated as the most dangerous city in America with a homicide rate of 68 per 100,000. And for this reason, thousands of residents began leaving for suburban cities like Vallejo or Pittsburgh. And as a result of this exodus, the cost of living became extremely cheap. This attracted hardworking immigrants and low-income residents of Southern California. Well, naturally, as they moved up to Richmond, many of these people brought their affiliations with them. They settled mostly in the flatlands of Richmond, which is comprised of three areas: North, Central, and South, all being equally as bad. Well, when they moved in, they realized that this was much different than LA. Here, colors don't matter. People just represent their street or project. Well, the Southsiders weren't really liking this structure, so they brought their LA mentality with them. They decided to form 4 barrios in Richmond. First, you have Vario Frontera Locos, also known as VFL. They cover North Richmond, including the infamous Trojan projects. VFL was the biggest stronghold early on, and the wildest too. You'll see why in a second. Just across the train tracks, Richmond sur Trece, also known as RST, would form a large section as well. Then in central Richmond, the Central Side Locos would form between 16th and 21st. And finally, the Easter Hill Locos formed in South Richmond's Easter Hill projects. All of the sections rolled together and openly wore blue in Richmond. Interestingly enough, they only rarely ran into issues. This is because Nortes didn't have a unified presence. Instead, members were sprinkled throughout the city. And due to this, the Southsiders thought they had zero resistance, a piece of cake if you will, but quickly they learned of a large Northside presence not too far away. The unincorporated city of San Pablo is located right above Richmond. Technically, it's not Richmond, but it's basically the same thing. The only difference is that the entire city of San Pablo is covered by Northsiders. And despite being its own city, these guys are only a couple blocks away from North Richmond. Well, when these guys found out about each other, things got really bad. The 2000s became a true battleground between red and blue. You never knew what could go down on any given day. Starting off, VFL was the wildest by far. They wanted to test anyone wearing red, and this is just an awful part of Richmond history. Starting in December of 2007, VFL went out looking for any members they could find. Their days consisted of hanging out in North Richmond during the day and going out looking at night. So let's dive in. December 22nd, 2007. It's a Saturday night and 3 VFL members meet up on 4th and Grove in North Richmond. Just a few days prior, the VFL members had gotten into a confrontation with their RST allies, but rather than taking it to an unnecessary level, both sides decided to fight it out. So one of the members calls them, but they don't pick up. So now what does VFL do on this Saturday night? They're bored in Richmond, so they decide to drive out to San Pablo looking for rivals. 11 p.m. Francisco Romero drives and Hector Molina and Jorge Sanchez get in the back. They head to the Broadway area where rival members are known to be, and on the corner they spot a man in a red hoodie walking with a friend. So Hector Molina asks the driver to pull over and let him out. So he hops out of the car and walks up to the guy in the red hoodie. He yells, "This VFL," and sadly he makes a horrible decision. Later on the news, they found out that the guy in the red hoodie was just a student at Richmond High School, and more importantly, he wasn't affiliated with anything. And this instantly made it a high-profile case for Contra Costa County. Well, early on, they received an anonymous tip, so Richmond police investigated Hector Molina. After searching his car, they found a blower, a baseball bat, and a blue bandana. However, it didn't match the casings in San Pablo, so they only booked him for concealed carry. The judge would let him out the next day. So Hector called a fellow VFL named Victor Cervantes to come pick him up. So Victor came, and during the car ride, Hector told him everything he had done. This would end up being a bad decision for him. Later on, Victor would testify against him in court, but we're not there yet. For the meantime, the Southsider madness continued. January 26, 2008. It's another Saturday night in Richmond, and that means that house parties are jumping. Mind you, this is in the middle of the hyphy movement, so the entire Bay Area is lit. And on this particular night, RST members are looking for a move. They hear about a party in San Pablo thrown by regular civilians, not affiliated members. However, the party is located in rival territory, so they're definitely on tip. Well, when they arrive, a member named Fernando Garcia, also known as Danger, gets weary. He notices a guy in the back of the party with a red hat and red shoes. So he walks through the party and gets in the man's face. He says, "You can't be wearing all that red in Richmond." The man, who's confused as ever, says, "What?" So Danger yells at him even louder. The party goes silent and all of the RST members run over to see what's going on. All they see is their friend arguing with a man in red. So a member named Jose Martinez takes it to another level. Bang! Again, it turns out that the victim was not affiliated with anything. This was yet another case of mistaken identity in Richmond. This literally happened for no reason, and the people at the party felt the exact same way. Many of the party attendees cooperated with police and pointed out Jose Martinez. On top of this, remorseful RST members testified as well. They all did the right thing, and Jose Martinez got life in prison. Random incidents like this were a foreign concept in the Bay. Prior to this, most incidents were behind personal conflicts. And now the Southsiders introduced this terrible theme to Northern California. Sadly, the foolishness would continue. February 16th, 2008. We head back to North Richmond VFL, and again it's a Saturday night, which means it's party time. So the regular crew are hanging out in North Richmond waiting for a move. A friend named Larry Valencia also happens to be looking for one as well, so he calls them up. They tell him to pull up to North and figure it out from there. So Larry arrives and they decide that they're gonna drive around looking for a party to attend. They head out in 2 cars. Jose Mota, Hector Molina, and Jorge Camacho in one. And Cole Amazar, Larry Valencia, and Luis Hernandez head out in another. After circling around Richmond, they can't find anything. So they decide to head up to San Pablo. 11 p.m. Larry Valencia notices that Camacho and Mota are parked and arguing with a man in red. So he pulls a U-turn to see what's happening, but before he arrives, all he hears is bang. He sees Camacho on top of the man in red, so Larry gets scared and speeds away. Sadly, a man named Luis Perez fell victim. And of course, he was not affiliated with anything either. And here's where things get interesting. On May 14th, 2008, the guys in the wrong car were arrested. This was Larry Valencia, Cole Amazar, and Luis Hernandez. They raided each person's home and found blue bandanas and VFL posters. This was enough to charge them for the February 16th incident. They had nothing to do with the incident whatsoever, so for them, doing life in prison was not an option. Larry Valencia would testify against his friend in the other car. Next, Cole Amazar would testify as well, telling police the exact same story. And this got Hector Molina, Jorge Camacho, and Jose Mota arrested. But this was obviously months after the incident took place, so in the meantime, the madness would continue. On February 27th, the same trio would run into rivals on San Pablo Avenue. During this confrontation, they accidentally claimed the life of Lisa Taller. In this case, Mota and Molina were found not guilty, but Jorge Camacho was found responsible. And that takes us to April 26, 2008. 3 VFL members, including Jose Mota, drive around San Pablo looking for rivals yet again. And on the corner of Broadway and 15th, they spot a man in a red bandana. So VFL's Javier Gomez gets out of the car and walks up to him. He says, "Are you a buster?" The man responds, "What does that mean?" And this response does not please Javier, so he makes a wild decision. It turns out that Rico in fact was not a member of anything. His family said that he wouldn't have even known what a red bandana could signify. Well, long story short, Gomez felt guilty and confessed about what he did. And with this, he implicated Mota as the driver. So they both received life in prison. In the end, nearly every VFL member told on their co-defendants. And because of this, all of these incidents were solved. These stories were all over the Bay Area news, sending fear to everyone at home. And this prompted middle and high schools all over the Bay Area to ban the colors red and blue. This is also because other regions like the Canal San Rafael and East San Jose were seeing the same issues. It was an awful new trend that the Bay Area was not ready for. Okay, let's head back to Richmond. Despite not being affected by any of these incidents, the San Pablo Nortes wanted to send a message of their own. So 2009 would be a wild year back and forth between both sides. And unfortunately, this brought crime numbers similar to the 1990s. In 2009, there were 47 homicides in Richmond, and that doesn't even include San Pablo. This number gave Richmond a rate of 46 per 100,000. For clarification, that was 3 times higher than Atlanta and double the rate of Oakland. So yes, at this time, Richmond was by far the worst city in Northern California, and this prompted major changes to take place. In 2011, the city voted to demolish the North Richmond housing projects with no plans of rebuilding. Instead, the residents were given housing vouchers to live elsewhere in the county. They also did this with other projects throughout the city. city. By the end of 2011, Richmond was a whole new place. Thousands of residents were displaced, and this meant rivalries spread out to other cities. Many members were now living elsewhere, but they remained as active as they once were. And that takes us to 2011. By the year 2011, a Richmond rapper named Lil G the Great began blowing up on YouTube. He repped his section hard despite being a Pinole resident. Lil G was from a Northsider area, specifically 17th and Sanford and San Pablo. However, many of his friends were VFLs from North Richmond. So for this reason, Lil G never chose a side and represented Richmond as a whole. This would seem like the safest route for anyone. However, playing neutral has its downsides as well. In early 2012, Lil G began working with rappers from Central Richmond, also known as the Deep Sea. By this time, North and Central Richmond had become bitter rivals. So being that Lil G began rapping with Central rappers, his VFL friends were not happy. But instead of confronting him like a man about it, they did something way worse. After a week or so of arguing with Lil G, VFL decides to make amends, or at least that's what he thought. So on February 21st, 2012, they invite him to hang out in North Richmond. His girlfriend begs him to lay low, telling him that his VFL friends are not trustworthy. But Lil G tells her that they've been friends forever and that they would never set him up. So he heads to Shields Park in North Richmond to meet up. When he arrives, the VFL members are standing in a line. Lil G is confused, so he goes to dap them up. But that's when they raise their hands for a different reason. The moral of the story is that sometimes your girlfriend is the realest one on your team. Well, the sad story led Richmond police on a VFL investigation. They were the wildest guys the Bay Area had ever seen, but for now, there was no evidence. The case would remain open for a few years. In the meantime, VFL was unstoppable. The only thing that could possibly stop them was themselves. Later in 2012, a VFL member named Luis Hernandez was arrested for DPing a fellow member. Apparently, the member had given up information on cases from 2008. Interestingly enough, after being arrested, Luis became an informant himself. In 2015, Luis told investigators who claimed the life of Lil G. Why he did this? Well, they gave him $68,000. As a result, 4 VFL members were given life, and Luis Hernandez was sent to another state under a new alias. Today, Richmond is nothing like it once was. The crime levels have plummeted lower than ever before, and that's something to be proud of. Regardless, the Southsiders are still active and feared throughout the Bay Area. There are documented stories of the Southsider takeover all over the net. Well, on that note, I hope you guys enjoyed the video and make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Peace!